The main armory of the Galactic Alliance flagship, Vigilance, was less a room and more a cathedral dedicated to the art of war. Its vaulted ceilings soared into darkness, crisscrossed by glowing conduits that pulsed with the ship's lifeblood. The air hummed with a clean electric thrum, smelling sharply of ozone and ionized metal. Light panels cast a sterile white glare on rows upon rows of charging stations, where the sleek, elegant exoskeletons of the Alliance forces stood like silent sentinels. Here, a squad of insectoid Cathar chittered as they calibrated their plasma casters. There, a towering Urtan warrior polished the grav plates on his massive shock hammer. It was a place of pristine, deadly efficiency. Lieutenant Xylar of the Xylos race stood at his station, a perfect embodiment of this modern military doctrine. Tall and slender, his movements were as fluid and precise as a surgeon's. He was performing a final diagnostic on his armor, a magnificent suit forged from psionically resonant crystal, a hallmark of Xylon craftsmanship. It was less a piece of equipment and more an extension of his own body. As he ran a gloved hand over its surface, faint blue light traced the path of his fingers, the suit's energy shields shimmering in response to his innate mental commands. The armor was flawless, its surface an unbroken mirror of silver blue, reflecting the ordered perfection of the armory around him. He was a product of his culture, logical, advanced, and a firm believer that the newest solution was always the superior one. The current war against the Swarm was a testament to that belief. It was a war of technology, of strategy, and of the unified strength of the Alliance's most advanced races. His gaze drifted from his own reflection to a corner of the armory that seemed to defy the room's entire philosophy. It was the human section, or rather, the section occupied by the single human NCO assigned to his platoon, Sergeant Anya Sharma. Her alcove was an island of organized chaos in the sea of sterile order. Instead of a clean diagnostic interface, her workstation was cluttered with tools that seemed brutally archaic to Xylar: heavy magnetic wrenches, a portable arc welder with a scarred nozzle, canisters of lubricant, and cloth stained with grease and carbon. It was a mechanic's bay, not a warrior's alcove. And then there was the armor itself. It stood on its service rack like a tired old beast of burden amidst a stable of thoroughbreds. It was a bulky, slate-gray suit, a composite of ceramic plates bolted onto a thick steel weave underlayer. It possessed none of the elegance of his Xylon suit. Its lines were brutally functional, designed for a species that had evolved under the crushing weight of a high-gravity world. But it was the surface that drew Xylar's professional disdain. It was a veritable roadmap of violence. A deep gouge, longer than his hand, scarred the right pauldron, its edges still showing the metallic stress of a powerful blade or claw. The left greave was peppered with a constellation of small, sharp indentations, the kind left by shrapnel from a chemical explosive. A wide circular scorch mark sat directly over the chest plate, where the ceramic had been melted into a glassy, dark swirl, a near-fatal shot from an energy weapon that had been absorbed just barely. Some plates were a slightly different shade of gray, clear evidence of field repairs made with mismatched parts. The Alliance insignia, a starburst of silver and blue, had been freshly stenciled on the shoulder, but it was painted over the faint, almost invisible outlines of older symbols, layers of forgotten allegiances. When she moved a joint, it made a soft, metallic shink of articulation, a sound of pure mechanics that was alien in the silent hum of the armory. Xylar had tried to rationalize it. Perhaps humanity, being newer to the Alliance, was a poorer race. But that wasn't true. Their industrial output was formidable. He'd concluded it was a matter of stubbornness, an illogical emotional attachment to an object that was, by any tactical measure, a liability. Its structural integrity was a collage of weak points. He felt a wave of professional concern, tinged with a slight pity. It was his duty as an officer to ensure every member of his team was operating at peak efficiency. Her sentimentality was a risk to them all. He strode across the polished deck, his own suit silent, his presence announced only by the faint blue glow that seemed to follow him. He stopped just outside her workspace. Anya Sharma didn't look up. She was focused on the armor's gauntlet, using a torque wrench to tighten a series of bolts with practiced, powerful turns. She was not tall like him, but compact, her muscles coiled with a density that spoke of a life lived, resisting a constant, powerful gravity. "Sergeant Sharma," Xylar began, his voice calm and modulated, the way he had been taught at the academy. It was a tone meant to convey authority without aggression. She gave a slight nod to show she was listening, but her hands never stopped their work. "I have been reviewing the platoon's equipment readiness reports," he continued. "Alliance High Command provides every soldier with state-of-the-art Mjolnir-class exoskeletons. They are lighter, stronger, and have fully integrated energy shielding. A formal request from me would have one issued to you within the hour." Anya finished with one bolt and moved to the next, her movements economical. "This one works just fine, Lieutenant." Her voice was low, with a gravelly timbre that seemed to match the texture of her armor. Xylar persisted, his logic unassailable in his own mind. "Its performance is objectively inferior. The material integrity is compromised in at least 17 locations. It lacks even a basic kinetic barrier. It is, with all due respect, a relic." He gestured around at the gleaming, perfect suits lining the walls. "It is an anomaly." "It's reliable," she countered, her tone flat. She put down the wrench and picked up an oilcloth, wiping down a piston on the leg joint. This was the point of friction he could not comprehend. Her stubborn refusal to upgrade was illogical. "But it looks so worn," Xylar insisted, a note of frustration finally entering his voice. The simple statement did what his entire logical argument could not. Anya stopped. The oilcloth hung limply in her hand. For the first time, she turned her full attention to him. Her face was weathered, with lines around her eyes that spoke of years spent staring into harsh suns or squinting against explosions. Her eyes themselves were a pale, clear gray, and as they met his, Xylar felt a sudden, unexpected chill. He had seen veteran soldiers before, but her gaze held a depth, a sense of time, that was utterly profound. It was like looking into the deep, dark water of a well and not being able to see the bottom. She looked at him, then at her armor, then back at him. She reached out and gently tapped the deep, dark scar on the chest plate, the one over her heart. Her touch was surprisingly gentle, because it's older than this war. Xylar walked away from Anya's workstation, her words echoing in the sterile air of the armory. Because it's older than this war. The statement was a paradox, a non sequitur. He processed it not as an answer, but as a deflection, a piece of cryptic human folklore designed to end an uncomfortable conversation. He was a Xylon, a being of logic. If a piece of data did not compute, it was either flawed or irrelevant. He filed her response under the ladder and proceeded toward the ship's command center, the faint sense of dissatisfaction leaving a bitter taste in his mind. The interaction was a failure, a loose thread in the otherwise perfect tapestry of Alliance order. The strategy deck of the Vigilance was the antithesis of Anya's gritty alcove. It was a cavern of silent, focused energy. A vast, three-dimensional holographic star chart dominated the center of the room, its nebulae and star systems glowing with ethereal light. Waterfalls of data streamed down transparent screens, chronicling fleet movements, supply levels, and casualty reports. Officers from a half-dozen species stood at their consoles, many with the faint blue glow of a neural interface at their temples, absorbing and processing information at speeds no unaugmented human could comprehend. This was where wars were won, not with wrenches and oil, but with predictive algorithms and flawless data. At the heart of it all was Commander Vorlag, a senior Xylon officer whose crystalline armor was adorned with the insignia of a dozen successful campaigns. He stood before the main holotable, his sharp eyes scanning the projected movements of the enemy. The tactical problem was clear. The swarm, a ravenous hive mind species, had just been routed from their primary nest in the Cygnus X1 system. After weeks of brutal fighting, they were in full retreat. The question on every officer's mind was, where to? The probability engines are conclusive, Vorlag announced, his voice amplified by the room's acoustics. 87% probability that the surviving swarm fleets will consolidate at the Serpent's Coil. It offers tactical concealment and is the most logical point to defend, while the hive mind reestablishes command and control. Xylar, standing near the command circle, nodded in silent agreement. It was the only logical move. The AI models, fed with every scrap of data from past encounters, all pointed to the same conclusion. The swarm, for all its alien ferocity, operated on a cold, predatory logic. The Serpent's Coil was their optimal move. The commander was already outlining a pursuit vector, a swift, decisive strike to crush the enemy before it could recover. It was then that a new voice cut through the digital hum of the deck. It was quiet, unamplified, and jarringly analog. "They're not going to the Serpent's Coil." Every head turned. Sergeant Anya Sharma stood near the bulkhead, just inside the entrance. She was out of her armor now, dressed in a simple gray utility uniform, yet she seemed to carry its weight with her. She had no right to be on the strategy deck during a command briefing, but no one had thought to stop her. She watched the holotable not with the analytical gaze of a strategist, but with the steady, patient eyes of a hunter watching her prey. Commander Vorlag's brow furrowed. "Elaborate, Sergeant. Your presence here is irregular." Anya took a step forward, her boots making a soft, solid sound on the deck plating. She gestured toward the holomap with her chin. "They're falling back, but it's a feint. They're drawing us into the asteroid field of X9 on the edge of the system." "On what basis do you make that assumption?" Vorlag challenged, his tone sharp with impatience. "Our models are based on the totality of the swarm's known behavior. There is zero data to support such a high-risk maneuver." Anya's gaze became distant, as if she were looking at something far beyond the walls of the ship. She unconsciously raised a hand and touched a faint, web-like scorch mark near the temple of her helmet, a phantom gesture as the helmet itself was back in the armory. 20 years ago, during the Cathar Rebellion, the Cathar were cornered in the rings of Orelon. They broadcasted a false retreat signal, luring our capital ships into the densest part of the rings. The dust was thick with metallic particles. It played hell with our sensors and shorted out our energy shields. They tore us apart. She paused. The Cathar weren't clever. They were just bullies who stole their best tricks. They learned that one from a species they'd wiped out a century before. Xylar felt a flicker of interest. He had studied the Orelon campaign at the Academy. It was a textbook example of underestimating an enemy in their own territory. Anya's hand then drifted lower, as if tracing the outline of a dent on her leg guard. Years later, a band of Skryl pirates tried the same thing on our patrol at Vega Colony, a less elegant version. They didn't have the patience. We saw it coming and turned their trap against them. The lesson is, the tactic evolves. It gets passed on. She finally looked directly at Vorlag, her eyes holding his. Last month, Alliance forces, with support from the Third Fleet, destroyed a minor swarm nest on Cathar Prime. The swarm doesn't just conquer, it absorbs, it learns. They took that tactic from the Cathar's dying thoughts. The retreat from Cygnus isn't a sign of weakness, it's bait, and the asteroid field at X9 is the kill zone. A heavy silence fell over the strategy deck. The officers looked from the flawless, data-driven predictions on the holotable to this human NCO who was weaving a narrative from old battles and half-forgotten skirmishes. Commander Vorlag was the first to break it, his voice laced with condescending disbelief. You are basing a fleet-level strategic prediction on anecdotal evidence and scars? Sergeant, this is a war council, not a storyteller's circle. We act on data, not hunches. Xylar was torn. Everything in his training, in his Xylon nature, screamed that the commander was right. Data was immutable. Probability was truth. Yet, he could not dismiss the cold certainty in Anya's voice. He remembered her eyes in the armory, the unsettling feeling that she was seeing a far bigger picture than he was. Her logic wasn't based on algorithms. It was based on the simple, brutal fact of survival. She had survived things the AI had only simulated. Forlag, seeing the indecision on some of his officers' faces, let out an exasperated sigh. He was too good a commander to ignore even the slimmest possibility of a threat. He would not change the primary fleet objective, but he would not be called careless either. Fine, he snapped, turning to a communications officer. Divert a single long-range scout drone to the X9 asteroid field. Acknowledged? Acknowledged, Commander, the officer replied. Vorlag turned his back on Anya, dismissing her. Now, back to the pursuit vector for the Serpent's Coil. We have a real war to win. The briefing continued, but the atmosphere had changed. A seed of doubt had been planted. Xylar watched Anya as she gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, then turned and walked silently from the strategy deck, leaving the echoes of her history hanging in the sterile, data-filled air. The order to launch came sooner than expected. Xylar found himself strapped into a troop harness aboard the assault craft Spearhead, the low thrum of its engines vibrating through the deck plates. Around him, the rest of his Xylon fire team sat in quiet readiness, their crystalline armor glowing with a soft, confident light. The mood was one of professional calm. The plan was simple, a textbook pursuit and envelopment. Their target was the Serpent's Coil, and their victory, according to the data, was all but assured. Xylar ran a final, silent diagnostic, his mind interfacing with his suit. All systems were green. He felt the familiar surge of power, the cool certainty of technological superiority. Across the bay, Sergeant Anya Sharma was engaged in a ritual that seemed almost profane in its physicality. She wasn't interfacing, she was checking. She had field-stripped her hulking kinetic rifle on the deck, her bare hands moving with a practiced efficiency as she cleaned the firing mechanism with a chemical solvent, then reassembled it with a series of satisfyingly solid clicks. She slammed a heavy magazine into the receiver, the sound unnervingly loud in the humming quiet of the craft. Then she moved on to her sidearm and the combat knife sheathed on her thigh. It was the preparation of a craftsman, not a digital warrior. It was the work of someone who did not merely trust her tools, but knew them intimately. A sudden jarring alert klaxon ripped through the vessel, a sound no one was expecting. A frantic voice, distorted with static, crackled over the ship-wide communication. Command, this is Scout Drone X9. I have visual. The field is... it's not empty. They're everywhere. Thousands of... oh, stars! The voice cut out, replaced by a half-second of screaming data shriek, a chaotic burst of images, swarm bioships detaching from asteroids like horrific parasites, engine signatures blooming in the darkness, and then utter silence. Chaos was instantaneous. Before the fleet could even begin to process the new reality, the universe outside the Spearhead's viewport erupted in violence. The swarm wasn't in front of them, it was all around them. They had jumped into real space from the cover of the asteroid field, a perfectly executed ambush. The Spearhead lurched violently, throwing Xylar against his harness as a swarm torpedo impacted a cruiser somewhere off their port bow. Red alert klaxons blared, and the calm confidence of moments ago evaporated into a frantic scramble for survival. Then came the wave. It was visible even through the armored viewports, a shimmering, sickly green ripple of energy that expanded from the heart of the swarm fleet. It washed over the Vigilance and its support craft, silent and insubstantial, yet utterly devastating. Xylar felt it as a nauseating tingle that went straight to his bones. The blue glow of his crystalline armor flickered erratically. His heads-up display dissolved into a waterfall of corrupted pixels. The low hum of his suit's power core died with a pathetic whine. A profound silence descended inside his helmet, the silence of dead technology. He was trapped, his powered suit suddenly nothing more than a heavy, inert metal shell. Around him, his comrades suffered the same fate, their magnificent armor rendered useless, their energy rifles instantly inert. A deafening screech of tortured metal tore through the ship as boarding claws ripped into the spearhead's hull. An explosive charge blew the main troop door off its hinges, and the swarm was upon them. They were even more horrific up close than in simulations. Towering insectoid monstrosities with chitinous plates tougher than steel, their limbs ending in scythe-like claws, their chittering mandibles drooling corrosive saliva. The Xylon soldiers, paragons of modern warfare, were now helpless. They drew their emergency blades, but in the tight confines of the corridor, they were clumsy, their dead armor hindering their movements. A warrior next to Xylar was swatted aside, his chest plate cracking like porcelain. Xylar, a tactician trained for ranged energy combat, was frozen for a critical second, his mind unable to process this sudden descent into brutal, primitive butchery. A swarm warrior lunged for him, its claws extended. Suddenly, a massive gray form slammed into his side, shoving him hard against a bulkhead. The swarm warrior's claws raked against solid armor with a horrifying shriek of metal on chitin, scraping a fresh groove into a pauldron, but failing to find purchase. Anya Sharma stood over him, her stance wide and solid, a rock in the tide of chaos. Her armor was untouched by the energy wave, its purely mechanical systems immune. In her hands, her kinetic rifle seemed to roar to life. The sound was deafening, a visceral, concussive crack, crack, crack that dwarfed the pathetic hiss of failing electronics. Each shot was a physical event, a blast of sound and force that hammered the senses. Heavy-caliber slugs tore through the swarm's armored bodies, not with the clean cauterization of plasma, but with messy, brutal kinetic energy, shattering chitin and throwing the creatures backward. It wasn't elegant. It was savagely effective. When a swarm warrior got past her initial volley, she didn't back away. She moved forward, using the sheer mass of her suit as a battering ram, slamming her shoulder into its chest. She used her forearm to block a claw strike, the impact echoing like a hammer on an anvil. With her other hand, she drew her combat knife and drove it up under the creature's mandible with a grunt of exertion. Another warrior lunged at Xylar as he struggled to bring his useless blade to bear. Anya pivoted, placing herself directly in its path. The creature's primary claws, sharp enough to shear through a starship's hull, raked across her chest plate. The sound was a cataclysmic scream of tearing metal. Xylar saw sparks fly as the claws carved deep, smoking furrows into the armor, right over the spot where the old energy burn was. For a terrifying moment, he thought the armor would buckle, but it held. The ancient, battered plate endured the assault, its duty fulfilled once more. Anya ignored the impact, planting her feet and firing her rifle point blank, ending the threat. In moments that felt like an eternity, she cleared their small section of the corridor, creating a defensible choke point behind a stack of cargo containers. The immediate assault subsided, replaced by an eerie quiet, broken only by the crackle of fires and the distant sounds of battle. Xylar leaned against the bulkhead, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked at the dead, useless marvel of technology encasing him, then at Anya. She stood amidst the carnage, reloading her rifle with a steady, practiced hand. His gaze was drawn to the front of her armor. A fresh, deep gash now scarred the chest plate, its edges still glowing with residual heat. The new wound lay directly over the old, a fresh layer of violent history written in steel. The abstract lesson of the strategy deck was now a brutal, undeniable truth. etched into the very metal that had just saved his life. The corridor was a tomb of twisted metal and shadows. The only light came from a single emergency strip on the ceiling, its angry red pulse painting the scene in rhythmic flashes of crimson and black. The air was thick with the acrid stench of burnt chitin and ozone, a smell that clung to the back of the throat. Distant, mournful groans echoed through the ship's structure, the sound of a great beast dying. Xylar sat with his back against the cold bulkhead, the dead weight of his own armor, a suffocating prison. He felt a profound, hollow shame. His suit, a marvel of Xylon engineering, was now nothing more than a coffin. Anya moved with a startling lack of urgency. Her first act was not to reinforce the barricade or call for aid, but one of brutal practicality. She knelt beside him, her helmet retracted, and her gray eyes scanned him with the detached efficiency of a field medic. "Any breaches? Pain? Numbness?" she asked, her voice low and even. Xylar could only shake his head, his own voice lost somewhere in his throat. He was unharmed, physically. Satisfied, she turned her attention to her own armor. From a pouch on her hip, she produced a tool that Xylar barely recognized. It was a portable, high-temperature arc welder, its design simple and robust. With a low hiss, its tip glowed a brilliant, blinding white. She knelt before the fresh, smoking gash on her chest plate, the new wound carved by the swarm warrior. She began to work, not with the finesse of a technician, but with the steady hand of a blacksmith mending a trusted shield. The welder hissed and spat, laying a thick, ugly bead of molten metal into the gaping wound, sealing the breach. Watching her tend to the armor's injury as if it were living flesh finally broke Xylar's silence. The question that came was not the one he would have asked an hour ago. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a deep, humbling awe. "How?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "How did it hold?" "My armor. Its crystalline structure is rated to withstand a direct plasma strike. That creature's claws should have gone straight through your chest." Anya didn't pause in her work, the bright light of the welder illuminating the fierce concentration on her face. "This plate isn't crystal. It's layered. A ceramic outer shell to disperse energy, then a tungsten carbide trauma plate, then a ballistic weave of hybridized carbon. It's heavy, it's clumsy, but it's designed to stop a solid object driven by hate." She finished the weld, the new seam glowing cherry red, before slowly fading to a dull, angry gray. She ran a gloved hand over it, a gesture of assessment, not affection. She finally looked at him, her expression softening almost imperceptibly. "You asked why it was worn. You asked why I kept it. It's not because I'm stubborn. It's because I have a duty to its history." She tapped the newly sealed scar. "This suit has a name. It's called Oathkeeper." Xylar stared, waiting. The name felt significant, ancient. "It keeps an oath for my family," Anya continued, her voice taking on a storyteller's cadence. "My grandfather, Corporal Eris Sharma, wore this suit during the first contact wars against the Cathar. He was a fleet marine on the starship Indomitable." Her gaze drifted to the old, deep gouge on the pauldron, the one that had so offended Xylar's sense of order. "He got that scar when a Cathar warlord boarded their ship. He took the warlord's arm off with a combat knife a second later. He used to say the armor remembers every debt." The revelation was stunning. This suit had fought in a war that was history to Xylar, a chapter in his academy textbooks. "But its story didn't start with him," she went on, her voice dropping lower. "He inherited it. Before him, it served in the Martian uprising." She traced the faint, star-shaped pattern of pockmarks on the greave. "That's from a magnetic accelerator shotgun. Shrapnel. Humans fighting humans in the tunnels under Olympus Mons." That's where the design philosophy was truly born. We learned early that when you fight your own kind, you can't rely on energy shields, EMPs, pulse weapons. They're too easy to make, so we built for kinetic resistance. We built to survive brute force, because we knew, better than anyone, how brutal we could be. A cold dread trickled down Xylar's spine. The idea of a species waging such ferocious war upon itself, developing technology specifically for fratricide, was deeply unsettling to the Xylon mind. Anya seemed to read his thoughts. Her eyes held a profound sadness. And even that wasn't the beginning. Her gloved finger hovered over the oldest, most faded scar of all, a faint, web-like pattern of cracks near the suit's hip joint that was almost invisible under the layers of paint and grime. This suit's ancestor, its original design blueprint, was forged for a conflict you wouldn't even find in your galactic history archives, a war on our own homeworld, Earth. We called it the Great War, fought in trenches of mud and blood, with chemical weapons and crude explosives that threw metal splinters through the air. This armor's soul was born in that mud. It was designed to keep a simple human soldier alive while his world tried to tear itself apart. The truth settled on Xylar with an impossible weight. He wasn't looking at a piece of armor. He was looking at a library of human violence, a monument to their terrifying capacity for conflict. The suit wasn't worn because it was old. It was worn because it had survived humanity. "We don't keep it out of sentiment," Anya said, her voice firm again, pulling him from his reverie. "We keep it as a reminder that our greatest weapon isn't our starships or our plasma cannons. It's this." She balled her hand into a fist and thumped it against the freshly welded scar on her chest. The sound was a dull, solid thud. "It's the will to get back up after you've been knocked down. Technology fails. Plans fail. Hope fails. This is what's left when all of that is gone. It's the oath that we will endure, that we will survive our enemies, and if we must, we will even survive ourselves." Xylar looked from Anya to the Oathkeeper. He finally understood. Its weight wasn't a flaw. It was a feature. Its lack of sophistication wasn't a weakness. It was its greatest strength. It was the most advanced piece of technology he had ever seen, not because of its components, but because of its data, centuries of hard-won, bloody, empirical data. He slowly reached out, his fingers tracing the edge of the new scar. It was still warm. In that moment, he felt the heat not just of the weld, but of all the history that lay beneath it. He was no longer an officer looking at a subordinate. He was a student looking at a master, humbled by a lesson written in scarred steel. The touch of Xylar's fingers against the warm metal of the Oathkeeper's scar was a moment of silent communion. The distant groans of the ship and the flickering emergency lights seemed to fade, leaving only the two of them in the barricaded corridor. When he drew his hand back, the reverence in his eyes was absolute. He had not merely heard a story. He had touched the pages of a history book written in violence and survival. The weight of his own inert armor no longer felt like a prison, but a lesson. He pushed himself to his feet, the dead mechanics of the suit groaning in protest, and moved to a defensive position covering the opposite end of the corridor. He was no longer a Xylon lieutenant assessing a human sergeant. He was a soldier in a fire team, and she was his line of defense. Anya gave him a single, sharp nod of acknowledgement. An understanding had been forged between them, stronger than any welded plate. The quiet was shattered by a burst of static from the speaker on Anya's helmet, a sound loud enough for Xylar to hear clearly. "Spearhead, this is Sergeant Rex, Engineering Deck 7. We're cut off, but we have a plan. We're moving through the primary service conduits, the old ways. They're not on the swarm's schematics. Rendezvous at Junction 14, Aft Maintenance Hub. We're going to give the bugs a lesson in ship plumbing. Rex out." Anya's helmet retracted fully, her face grimly determined. "You heard him," she said to Xylar. "Junction 14, it's 5 levels down and 100 meters aft." It was a suicide run through a ship crawling with hostiles, and Xylar knew it. But for the first time, he felt a flicker of something other than despair. He saw the path forward, not as an equation of probabilities, but as a test of will. His mind, trained to see systems and schematics, began to work in a new way. "The service conduits will be tight," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. but their walls are reinforced to contain plasma ruptures. The swarm's claws won't get through them easily. There is a junction in Corridor 9 Gamma, just before the main access lift. According to the ship's original design, it houses a primary coolant line for the sublight engines. If we can rupture it, we can vent pressurized cryofluid. It will create a barrier and cover our tracks. Anya looked at him, a spark of genuine respect in her eyes. He was no longer thinking like a Xylon, waiting for his technology to save him. He was thinking like a human, looking for a way to turn the environment itself into a weapon. "A good plan," she conceded. "Let's go make a mess." What followed was a desperate, brutal fight through the wounded vessel. It was a terrifying education for Xylar. He learned to move inside his dead armor, to use its sheer mass as a shield and a battering ram. He learned the value of a low center of gravity. He and Anya moved as a seamless unit, a fusion of two vastly different doctrines. His mind, filled with the ship's blueprints, became their map. He would point out tactical vulnerabilities, a weak structural support, an unshielded power conduit, a volatile fire suppression canister. "To your left, Anya. That panel hides the hydraulics for the blast door, a single round in the actuator." Crack. Anya's rifle would bark, and a blast door would slam shut, crushing a swarm warrior. He was the strategist. She was the devastating force of execution. They fought their way through the guts of the ship, a ghost of modern knowledge paired with a specter of ancient warfare, leaving a trail of wreckage and dead swarm behind them. At Junction 14, they found Sergeant Rex and 4 other human soldiers, their armor just as battered and personalized as Anya's. It was a small pack of wolves, each one a veteran of conflicts Xylar had never dreamed of. Together, they put their plan into action. They didn't try to retake the bridge or fight a pitched battle. They descended into the ship's deepest engineering decks, and with a combination of brute force and technical sabotage taught by generations of grimy engineers, they overloaded the magnetic containment for the boarding ship's docking clamps. With a deafening groan, the swarm vessel was violently hurled from the spearhead's hull, its own power core rupturing in a silent, brilliant flash of green energy that lit up the void. Days later, the strategy deck of the Vigilance was a changed place. The frantic energy was gone, replaced by a somber quiet. The fleet had survived, but it was heavily damaged. Commander Vorlag stood before the hollow table, his own pristine armor now marred by a long scorch mark down one side. He was concluding the official debriefing. And thanks to the fleet's rapid redeployment and superior firepower, the swarm ambush was repelled, he stated, his voice lacking its usual triumphant edge. "Commander, a correction, if I may." All eyes turned to Lieutenant Xylar. He stepped forward, his posture straight, his gaze unwavering. He was not challenging his superior, he was clarifying the record for the sake of history. The fleet's survival was not due to superior firepower. It was due to the implementation of an asymmetric warfare doctrine we had previously failed to recognize, he said, his voice ringing with a new authority. While our primary systems failed, the human contingent's equipment, which we had dismissed as obsolete, proved to be our most proven asset. Their knowledge of kinetic combat, environmental exploitation, and decentralized command allowed them to cripple the enemy's boarding efforts from within. What we saw as a flaw, their reliance on primitive technology, was in fact their most profound strategic advantage. He paused, his eyes finding Anya where she stood in the back of the room. "They taught us that resilience is a weapon system unto itself." Commander Vorlag stared at him, then at Anya, his expression unreadable. He simply gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Your correction is noted, Lieutenant," and entered into the official record. The final scene of the story took place back in the armory. The room was quieter now, many of its charging stations empty or displaying damage reports. Xylar stood at Anya's workstation, but he wasn't polishing his own crystalline armor. He was studying the schematics of the Oathkeeper, projected from his wrist-mounted datapad. He was tracing the flow of its mechanical joints and the layout of its physical power conduits, his mind absorbing the genius of its simple, rugged design. Anya walked up behind him, wiping grease from her hands with a cloth. For a long moment, they stood in comfortable silence, the unspoken horrors of the battle and the hard-won respect forging a bond between them. "I have submitted a full report to Alliance High Command," Xylar said softly, never taking his eyes off the schematic. "I recommended a complete tactical review of human combat philosophy, not as an auxiliary force, but as a core doctrinal pillar." Anya simply nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. She held out a heavy, steel-gray torque wrench. "Good. In the meantime, the blast from that swarm warrior knocked the primary actuator in its left leg joint out of alignment. It's pulling to the right." She offered the tool to him. "Could use another pair of hands to brace it." Xylar looked from the complex hologram to the simple, heavy tool in her hand. He took the wrench. Its weight was solid, real, and purposeful. He turned off the holographic display, and together, he and Anya knelt before the Oathkeeper. The Xylon officer, the prodigy of a technological age, and the human sergeant, the keeper of an ancient legacy, began the quiet, important work of mending the armor that had saved them all. The war was far from over, but the Alliance was stronger now, for it had finally learned that its future would be forged not just in the light of its brightest stars, but in the lessons of its oldest scars.